Okay, so want to get to something that's important for understanding the entirety of World War II, and that is the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. We're going to get to this. It was the idea of a pan-Asian empire dominated by Japan, focusing on race and ethnicity, international unity among Asian groups, and destiny, the destiny of the Japanese people. Dealt with mutuality, solidarity, and coexistence. Now, there are similarities between the sphere and Nazi Germany. For example, race justified military conquest, the need for slave labor, the need for living space, or Lebensraum in German. Now, we're going to get to this, but we also see many similarities when it comes to military methodology. One of their theories was to befriend the conquered, but they did not necessarily befriend them. We'll get to that later. Um, Culturally, what was this about? Again, it was about Japanese superiority, about the moral purity of the Asian race, specifically of the Japanese. It was about the warrior tradition. Regarding economic goals, again, the idea of raw materials for manufacturing industry, to keep its military supplied in China and elsewhere, and notably to seek Japanese self-sufficiency. Japan, just like Nazi Germany, wanted to establish itself as a self-sustaining unit. Politically, colonization would provide international prestige as a first-rate country. Now, we talked briefly about the insults lobbed at the Japanese at Versailles and then early on in the League of Nations. The West further insulted Japan at the Washington Conference. Naval treaties allowed less for Japan, the 553 ratio for battleships, whereas Western countries like the United States and Britain would be allowed five. Japan would only be allowed three for every five of those countries. That was 1921 and 22. Again, we talked about Versailles. The West rejects Japanese request for racial equality clause in the League Covenant. They are denied lands they believe they have earned through their work in World War I. And in the United States, we have the 1924 Exclusion Act, which shut off Japanese immigration to the United States. And there is a much longer history of antipathy toward Japanese immigrants going back to the late 19th century. Now, Peter Deuce, D-U-U-S, of Stanford, is one of the more notable scholars of the sphere. He discusses Japanese Pan-Asianism. Again, the idea that there would be a block of Asian nations with Japan as the leader. This would include Korea, Taiwan, Sakhalin, China, Manchukuo, French Indochina, and the Dutch East Indies. Manchukuo, of course, the part of Manchuria that Japan had conquered and then renamed. The sphere would become the official policy by mid-1941, and it would be accepted by Japanese people as well. This was imperialistic opportunism under the guise of altruistic nationalism or benevolent nationalism with political control as the agenda. Again, part of this is working on the concept of an Asian community. This is popular really throughout the century, even going back to the 19th century. All people of Asia were bound together by natural unity, by affinity, by commonality, by culture, by physical appearance somewhat, by philosophical traditions. This is important. And there's a sense of historical kinship. The Dokkan, the common roots, the Dobun, common culture, Doshu, common race, and the Doso, common ancestors. Now, I had mentioned Deuce, one of his works dealing with the yellow man's burden. Which we'll kind of get to a little bit more here. This is similar to what we see with the white man's burden in late 19th century American imperialism. The idea that it is, in our case, it was the white man, and this is Rudyard Kipling in his poem dealing with American involvement in the Philippines. He felt this way about England and the United States, that it was the white man's responsibility to lift up other peoples. In Japan, we have the yellow man's burden. This was the civilizing mission based more on national superiority than racial superiority. But again, the idea that it was Japan's burden to raise these people up. There's an excellent work about Manchuria, the culture of wartime imperialism by Louise Young, her work Japan's Total Empire, which discussed the importance of culture in the empire, the belief that the Japanese viewed the Chinese as socially backward, militarily weak, and childlike. Japan would act as a type of parent toward China through a colonial mission to modernize China and help it progress as other nations had. This was a racial mission to lift up the Chinese. Korean and historian Hong Jun-soon argues in his work that Japanese intellectuals believed China was still not a modern nation, that internationalism derives from nationalism, and that China had not yet reached this stage of nationalism. Japan could civilize China and thus help it become a modern nation via mutual economic development. Per the author, quote, coexistence would become co-prosperity. Similar efforts were undertaken to civilize and modernize Korea, as can be seen in the work of the aforementioned Deuce, D-U-U-S, and his The Abacus and the Sword, The Japanese Penetration of Korea, 1895 to 1910. Domestically, the focus was on getting rid of the individualism that was so rampant in the West, to eliminate liberal institutions, parliamentary politics, and competitive markets. In reality, focus on economics more than culture. Japan was a have-not in the world economic order, at least that's how they felt at the time. This could usher in an era of cooperation, would allow former colonies to compete internationally. For the Japanese, World War II was a war of liberation. It was a war of racial awakening. It was a war of national emancipation. Colonial regimes would be liberated and become national regimes under the leadership of Japan. And again, this is a long-standing mission. It goes well into the 19th century. Because Japan had successfully modernized, it was natural for them to assume the leadership role, uplifting beleaguered fellow Asians in colonial countries. Showa Kenkyukie, or Kai, I apologize. This was a group of prominent Japanese intellectuals, journalists, and bureaucrats. In the 1930s, they popularized this notion, and they focused on cultural commonalities of Asians with Japanese and a proposed East Asian community. To these folks, again, it was destiny, and it was also destiny that Japan would be at the top of this order. And this becomes the basis for their new order in East Asia, designed to stop the spread of communism, promote economic cooperation, not competition, and create a new East Asian culture based on Asian principles, and again, ridding the area of the Western influences. Now, this would expand to the colonies with little common culture, but there was common interest, again, common experience of confrontation with the West, a common interest of expelling Western domination and influence from the region. Now, you can go back to the 19th century, think about the open door policy in China and the West kind of manipulating and exploiting China. We see this again throughout Southeast Asia. Think about French Indochina, many different areas that had been colonized and exploited by the West. Japan recognizes this, and this is key to their sphere. This was, again, to be of world historical significance. Think about the Depression. The world is thrown into this chaos by the West and its policies. Versailles failed to assure international peace or secure true self-determination. This was to be an historically significant event, not just for Japan, but for the rest of the world. War was not just a conflict, but a stage and a historical process to a new, more just international order. Now, going back a little bit, we want to provide a little bit of history to this. 19th century, we see the establishment of the Japanese Empire, which is proclaimed in 1868. What do we see before that? Japan is isolated. Similar to the United States would be for its first 120 years or so. Japan is even more isolated, though. They have absolutely isolated themselves from other countries, from outside influences. There is no interaction. In the late 1860s, we see this development. Now, in 1894 through 95, we have the first war with China, where they would cede Taiwan to Japan and allow trade on the mainland. A significant event 10 years later, the Russo-Japanese War. This was the first military victory by an Asian country over a European nation in modern times. It was humiliating for the Russians, who believed that they would simply walk right over the Japanese. And for the Japanese, again, this established a sense of international legitimacy that nothing previously had. 1910, after war with Korea, Japan would annex Korea. After World War I, they tried to establish a buffer zone between Japan and the USSR, but international pressures would limit this, and early in the war, we see Japan fighting with the Soviet Union. We go back even further, 1823, Britain would end its 21-year alliance with Japan, signaling the West's increasing apprehension. sorry, 1923. In the late 1920s, increasing nationalism and the embrace of traditional Japanese values, an eschewal of Western values, and this will ultimately lead to the Manchurian invasion in 1931 and the establishment of Manchukuo. Now, why Manchuria? Getting back to one of Hitler's main themes, living space. Japan was becoming increasingly crowded. They needed more space for their people. Additionally, Manchuria was rich in minerals. It was an ideal agricultural land, and there was significant forestry that would help, again, promote the idea of self-sufficiency within Japan. And as mentioned previously, there was a belief that the Chinese were inferior, that Japan would easily take this land, which they did, and then establish themselves and help to modernize or uplift the Chinese. Japan had invested a great deal of money and economic interests, such as the South Manchuria Railway Company, and stationed a large army there to guard these investments. Combine this with issues emanating from the Depression, and the Japanese people sought help. They had little faith in politicians, but did have faith in the military. So a full-scale invasion seemed logical. An explosion on a section of the railway was the justification. Japanese military officials blamed locals for sabotaging the railway and occupied the nearby town of Shenyang. The civilian government tried to put an end to this, but it had lost control of the army, and within a short time, the Japanese army controlled the entirety of Manchuria. The League attempted to expel the Japanese. There were verbal warnings, and then threats of cutting off trade. Though because of the Depression, this would, of course, be highly unlikely. Britain worried about its colonies, Hong Kong and Singapore, and their safety. Japan would simply leave the League and occupied the region around Manchuria for its defense. Again, the League of Nations being increasingly toothless between the wars. In 1937, we have what was called the Chinese Incident, Japanese garrison in conflict with Chinese government troops. It gives an excuse for war with China. Japan would take Shanghai, Beijing, Nanjing, and this, of course, would lead to the rape of Nanking, with 300,000 slaughtered, killed in barbaric ways. Many people disemboweled. The women were raped. Again, there is a lack of respect between the Japanese people and the Chinese people. By 1938, most of fertile China is occupied by Japan. A year later, in August of 39, we have the Mongolian invasion. Japan would again go to war with the Soviets. The USSR did receive significant intelligence, though. They were able to crush the Japanese with a counteroffensive led by Zhukov, Z-H-U-K-O-V. His name will be very important throughout World War II. The Japanese people would lose, or the Japanese government would lose a little bit of confidence. This is kept secret from the people. Key to this was the establishment of the Non-Aggression Pact between the Soviets and the Nazis. When Stalin did this, he knew he then did not have to worry about a Western front, so he put all of his troops in the East to crush the Japanese. Japan would seek mutual defense and support with the Nazis with the Tripartite Act of 1940. This further establishes them in the Axis. And in 1940, we also see the Nazis take the British merchant ship the Automedon with defense plans for Singapore and provides this information to Japan. Now, 1941, of course, is when the war really ramps up. Operation Barbarossa, which will be discussed in the next video lecture, brought appeasement of the Japanese from Britain, the Dutch, and the French. The French were forced to allow Japanese basing and transit rights in northern Indochina. The British closed off the Burma Road, which was used to transport aid to Chiang Kai-shek's armies in South China. The Dutch were bullied into maintaining key supplies from the East Indies, oil, rubber, tin, etc. So because of war in the West, in the East, Japan is again somewhat allowed to do what they want to. And make no mistake, China is key to this whole situation. Japan believed it had legitimately conquered its parts of China and believed Manchuria, or Manchukuo as they called it, was rightfully theirs. Japanese leadership was worried about Mao and his increasing power in the Chinese Civil War, but they did not like Chiang and his nationalists any better. Chiang Kai-shek, remember, was pro-Western. He was a nationalist. He could theoretically rally the people, if he could unify them, against Japanese power. It's really neither of the sides in the Chinese war are supported by Japan. And for Japan, again, they believed they would be better off if China was just in their grip altogether. Now, what of the United States? Why is the United States so concerned about China? In a sense, the United States was China's protector at the time. Historically, the two countries had worked together in many ways. The United States sent missionaries and educators to promote Christianity and Western learning. Trade was and always has been important between the two. And add to that the fact that China lobby was the most powerful of foreign policy interest groups in the United States. And their outrage from the China incident and the 4 years of war that had elapsed since, and it was no surprise that the U.S. was trying to strong arm the Japanese. And as the Japanese continued to move southward, the Philippines were becoming increasingly endangered. This, of course, had been part of the United States empire for decades. So you have a further animosity regarding that. Now, if we look at Japanese leadership, Emperor Hirohito, of course, is at the very top. And contrary to what some videos might claim, he was not he was not anti-war. He was not modern. He was not some friend of the West. He was absolutely on board with World War II, but that's for a different discussion. Let's talk a little bit about General Hideki Tojo, who was the Minister of War. Tojo, anti-Western. He was anti-communist. He was not racist or seeking destruction of people. He was simply pragmatic and, again, wanted to be part of the sphere. He wanted to help establish Japan's primacy over its sphere of influence. By doing this, subdue China and its empire, offer other Asian nations a place in the sphere. His alliance with Germany was for expediency. His goal, in Asia, liberated from Western presence with Japan as the leader of the sphere. And this goes back to one of the things I had mentioned earlier, and that is, again, working with those or trying to befriend those that you have conquered. In this sense, Tojo and Japan believed we conquer these smaller Asian nations, we befriend them, and they will work with us. Now, a little bit on the road to Pearl Harbor. A lot is made of the appeasement of Germany in Europe, and there is, of course, some appeasement of Japan in the East. But we also know the United States claims to be neutral. Prior to our entry into the war, we were not. The Neutrality Acts, the Lend-Lease Act, these provided direct support to the Allies. On the Eastern side, similar things happen. We are absolutely pro-West and anti-Japan in many of our actions. We'll get to a few of these right now. But make no mistake, we were not friendly with Japan in the interwar period, especially once the 1930s get going. And we certainly contributed to the tensions that would lead to war. Now, July of 1941, we have a tightening of embargoes by Roosevelt. This is a large example. Basically, Roosevelt threatened the Japanese, saying, loosen up on your idea of this sphere, of this empire, or else. Japan denies this, prepares for war while continuing to negotiate with the West. And this is another part. Japan did try to negotiate with the West. Now, in certain circumstances, some of their demands they knew could not be met, but they were negotiating with the United States. They were trying to relieve some of this because, for example, the oil embargo. Oil was necessary for the war machine. It was absolutely necessary for them to try to develop any kind of self-sufficiency. I know that sounds weird, but these things were necessary for Japan to expand and to modernize, and we were limiting this. So again, in July, we have the tightening of the embargoes. In October of 41, Tojo and his cohorts would petition the emperor to approve a military offensive. Tojo would be made prime minister at this time. November 1st, a meeting of Army, Navy, and civilian representatives was convened to consider proposals to the United States. There were two that were considered. A, Japan would offer the Americans a withdrawal of Japanese troops from China to be completed 25 years in the future. I laugh because, of course, there was no way this was going to be accepted and the Americans would reject it. A second option, withdrawal of troops from southern Indochina, where they had just arrived, if the Americans would sell Japan 1 million tons of aviation fuel. The United States refuses this as well, which Japan assumed would happen. They offered these proposals again, knowing they would not be accepted. Getting troops out of southern Indochina was not the main goal of the United States at this time. At this point, Tojo expresses fear to the emperor that if Japan did not seize the advantage now, quote, I am afraid we would become a third-class nation in 2 or 3 years. Also, if we govern occupied areas with justice, the hostile attitude toward us will probably soften. America will be outraged at first, but then she will come to understand. Anyway, I will carefully avoid making this a racial war. End quote. Basically, Tojo was saying take advantage now or face the decline of Japan, and this is something the emperor was not willing to relinquish. November 5th, we have the final decision for a war with the United States, with the Allies. This was still theoretically open to discussion up until the 25th, when the naval attack force would actually sail toward its offensive. Through magic, the code-breaking operation, the United States knew of these discussions and the duplicity. November 26th, the United States presents its ultimate position, a firm restatement of the position from which it had all begun. First of all, Japan was to withdraw its troops not only from Indochina, but from China as well. They were to accept the legitimacy of Chiang Kai-shek's government. They were to end Japan's association in the Tripartite Act. And with all this, U.S. would lift its economic restrictions. Now, I mentioned the other negotiations that Japan put forth, things that they knew the United States would not accept. Similarly, here, the United States knows Japan is not just going to give everything up just to lift these economic restrictions. Now, I mentioned military methodology, similar to Hitler and his idea of a blitzkrieg. Rapid, aggressive attacks and surprise were necessary for the Japanese. Why? Just as I ask this often in the comments, why would Hitler want to focus on blitzkriegs, on short, coordinated attacks? For each side, this was to avoid a long, drawn-out war. Japan and Nazi Germany each knew they could not win a long, drawn-out war, that a war of attrition would doom each of them. Now, on Japan's side, why would they want war with the U.S. or with the Allies altogether? Again, getting back to this fear, there is a fear of westernization. There is a desire to expel Western influence from Asia altogether. The United States and its threat to expansion. We talked about the Philippines. The United States was a protector of China. They had sent missionaries. They traded. Japan wanted to eliminate this. Oil, resources. Imperialist ambitions. Again, Japan is not self-sufficient with regard to food. They needed raw materials for their war machine. They needed rubber, non-ferrous metals, others for industry. And knowing if they go to war, especially if they start in China and start to make headway, they will be able to earn some of these. I go back to their treatment at the hands of the West. We mentioned Versailles. Japan's not treated as an equal. The 1922 Washington Naval Treaty relegated them to a lower place in the world's naval hierarchy. The Exclusion Act in 1924 in the United States. They did not feel the United States was willing to fight a difficult war either. They believed that the United States was soft, that it was not ready for true battle. Pearl Harbor would change this substantially, and some argue that this is what woke the beast, if you will, poking the beast while he's sleeping. They also underestimated the capacity of the United States to develop and manufacture war goods en masse and to deliver them. This, of course, will start with the other Allied powers, but the United States will then develop it on its own. The Japanese goal, first with Pearl Harbor and with the war altogether, initially with Pearl Harbor, to cripple the United States' ability to respond. That way, Japan may be able to expand into the Philippines and continue to expand. This would establish Eastern Asian hegemony, and the United States would be forced to recognize this new order as it focused on problems in Europe. Now, for Japan, for Tojo, for the emperor, the hope was, hey, the United States will focus on Europe, they'll leave us alone, and we can make our sphere. Didn't necessarily happen that way. Now, I want to get to a few things. Why did this ultimately fail? Okay, I hope I'm not spoiling anything. Japan does not win World War II. So I'm kind of ahead of the game here in discussing why they would ultimately fail. First, the focus on the war came first. Logistics were ignored. The occupation troops lived off the land. They forced assistance from local populations. Again, there is so much focus on the war, there's little on the larger context on their overall improvement. A second thing, I mentioned earlier that Tojo believed if they befriended the defeated and worked with them, that they would then work with the Japanese. This is not exactly what happened. Japan ended up being as harsh and exploitative of these other Eastern Asian nations as the Europeans were. For example, there was forced labor to help in the war effort. Others were forced to build roads, airstrips, railway lines. We see some slavery put into place. We see mass rape. And again, the rape of Nanking is one example, but it happens elsewhere. There were harsh conditions in these areas. There's little food. There's brutal supervision. There's little to no medical care. For example, an estimated 100,000 Burmese and Malay laborers died in construction of the Burma-Siam Railway. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese and Koreans were brought to work in coal mines and factories in Japan, so they were forced to migrate to work for the empire. They did not provide real independence to indigenous leaders. Again, you conquer these nations, you help them get away from Western domination. If you give them a little bit of sovereignty, a little bit of independence, they will probably work with you more, and who knows what can happen. One other reason to look at this, economic disruption throughout the sphere. Again, I mentioned some of the shortages, some of the issues in these southeastern nations that are conquered, but even in Japan, there are food shortages. There's a lack of consumption goods. There's rampant inflation, black marketeering, hoarding, speculation, unemployment. This hurts not only in these other areas, but in Japan itself. By 1945, in fact, anti-Japanese resistance movements emerged everywhere in Asia except the Dutch East Indies. Still, though, even in Japan today, there are people who are proponents of this idea of a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. Now, I do want to mention one work which focuses on the ultimate failure of Japan, if you will. Akira Iriye. I apologize for not getting the pronunciation right. This is a major historian, one of the more recognized and respected historians of Japanese and American interaction. Akira's book, Power and Culture, The Japanese-American War, 1941 to 45, relies on primary sources, internal communications, government archives. Akira argues Japan and the United States were in a Cold War prior to December 7th, 1941. Before 1929, Japan played the game with Britain and the United States and tried to follow the path laid out by Western powers. Again, they try to establish their empire. They use many of the Western ideals, even though they're focusing on an Asian empire and their own culture, their own philosophical and religious traditions. But they very much emulate what we see with Germany, France, Britain, and to an extent the United States at the end of the 19th century, and that's this build of empire. Now, after the crash of 1929 and the Great Depression, things would change. This is when we see escalation of the rise of the sphere mentality, which again has existed going back to the 19th century, but it really begins to emerge stronger here, partially because of their treatment at the hands of the West. So again, we see this rise of this sphere mentality, Akira argues, which stressed Asian unity, regional cooperation, harmony, selflessness, subordination of individual to the community. There's no more focus on global interdependence, cooperation, and peace between the tie between external affairs and domestic success. Almost this focus on the self, turning inward. Eastern traditions should be respected, its past greatness restored, in contrast to the West's egoism, rivalry and imperialism, focus on capitalism and competition. Akira points out Asia, in contrast, could claim a tradition of cooperation, of harmony, of mutual respect, and of integration. Akira also argues that Japan and the United States had more in common than they thought. If Japan had directly approached the Allies once they had assurance the emperor would not be deposed, they could have walked away losing nothing and prevented the onset of the atomic age and the Cold War, and this would have allowed a smooth transition to a peacetime alliance. Again, I'm getting ahead of the game here because you're well aware of the two bombs that are dropped, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Between these bombs, of course, there are negotiations, furious negotiations to prevent a second bomb from being dropped. The key, and this came out in the late 80s, I believe, when Emperor Hirohito's personal communications, his personal files were all released. It became clear that Hirohito denied peace negotiations after the first bomb unless he was assured of his title and his permanent relation to the people. This is a very nuanced relationship between the emperor and his people. He was the father figure. He was the one who they were all willing to die for. And this only further helps us understand kind of the sense, the sense in Japan, this reluctance to surrender, the reluctance to give up at all. Now, when we get to 1943 and 44, we'll get more into that. But all this is key to why the second bomb was dropped. But again, this is what Akira points out, that if Japan had simply worked with the West rather than demand the emperor keep his title, then a more smooth peacetime alliance could have been created, a smoother transition, etc. So that's the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. Again, key to understanding the war in the East.